Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, 1820–1913. From Elizabeth Ross Haynes' Unsung Heroes, published in 1921. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. About 100 years ago, people in every civilized country were talking about the Underground Railroad in the United States. The Underground Railroad was not really a railroad under the ground, but a secret way by means of which slaves escaped from their masters in the South and reached free territory. Reaching free territory sometimes meant escape from this country into Canada. Passengers, those seeking to escape to free territory on the Underground Railroad, were led by very brave and daring conductors. Among these conductors there was a woman whose name was Harriet Tubman. When Harriet was born in Dorchester County, Maryland, in 1820, she was named Araminta Ross. After she grew up, she called herself Harriet. When she became a woman, she was married to John Tubman and was called Harriet Tubman. Harriet almost died with the measles when she was 6 years old. Soon after she recovered from this, her master threw a heavy weight at her and injured her skull. For years she suffered from pressure on her brain, which caused her to fall asleep at any time, wherever she was, whether she was seated on a rail fence or in a chair. It also caused her to stagger sometimes as she walked. No one except her African mother seemed to care for her or to pay any attention to her. Early one morning a lady came driving up to the home of Harriet's master, who met her at the gate and inquired what he could do for her. She asked for a slave girl to care for her baby, but offered very low wages. The master shook his head, saying, "I cannot furnish you a girl for that." As the lady pleaded with him, he stood looking on the ground and knitting his brow. Suddenly he lifted his head and said, "Yes, I have just one girl whom you may take. Keep your eye on her, because she may not have all that is coming to her." Harriet was called, placed in a wagon, and driven away to the lady's home. The first thing the lady gave her to do was to sweep and dust the parlor. Harriet cautiously tiptoed into this wonderfully fine room, amazed at everything she saw. She finally began to sweep in much the same way as she had swept her mother's cabin. As soon as she had finished sweeping, she took the dusting cloth and wiped off the chairs, the table, and the mantelpiece. The particles of dust, still flying here and there over the room, soon settled on the furniture again. About this time Harriet's new mistress stepped in and began to look around. The dust lay on the table, the chairs, and the mantel in such a thick coating that she spoke very harshly to Harriet and ordered her to do the work all over. Harriet swept and dusted just as she had done before. The dust, having no other place to go, settled again on the furniture. The mistress entered the parlor again, bringing with her this time a whip. With this she lashed Harriet with a heavy hand. 5 times before breakfast that morning Harriet swept and dusted the parlor. Just as she had gotten her 3rd whipping, her mistress's sister, who had been awakened from her morning slumber, opened the parlor door. "Why do you whip the child, sister, for not doing what she has never been taught to do?" she asked. "Leave Harriet to me for a few minutes, and you will see that she will soon learn how to sweep and dust a room." The sister ordered Harriet to open the windows first, to sweep the room and leave it a while until the dust settled, and to return then and wipe the dust from the furniture. Harriet looked strangely at the big window, went to it and raised it inch by inch until it was high enough to fasten by a latch. She set in again and swept, and while the dust was settling she went out and set the table for breakfast. Then she returned and dusted the parlor. That night she was ordered to sit up and rock the baby. The baby's cradle and Harriet's chair were placed near her mistress's bed. Occasionally Harriet's eyelids dropped and her head bobbed this way and that. The cradle kept on rocking because her foot was on the rockers. Once in a great while the cradle would stop and the baby would begin to cry. The mistress would pick up her whip and give Harriet a cut across the head and shoulders, which would make her jump and almost knock the cradle over. Under such treatment Harriet became so worn and thin that the lady sent her back to her master, saying that she wasn't worth a sixpence. Harriet was turned over to her mother, who nursed her until she was again strong enough to work. She was then hired out to a man who made her plow, drive oxen, lift a barrel of flour, and sometimes cut a half cord of wood a day. Soon she became ill again. She lay on her sickbed from Christmas until March. Day after day she prayed, saying, "O Lord, convert old master, change that man's heart and make him a Christian." When someone told her that as soon as she was able to work she would be sent away, she changed her prayer, saying, "Lord, if you are never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way, so he will do no more mischief." Harriet's master finally died, but she continued ill for a long time. Even after she became stronger, she still prayed at every turn. When she went to the horse trough to wash her face and hands, she said, "Lord, wash me and make me clean." When she took the towel to wipe them, she cried, "O Lord, for Jesus' sake, wipe away all my sins." When she took up the broom to sweep, she groaned, "O Lord, whatever sin there is in my heart, sweep it out, Lord, clear and clean." Early one morning many of the slaves in the quarters hurried about with a scared look on their faces, whispering something to each other as they passed. The news had leaked out that Harriet and two of her brothers were to be sold and sent the next day to the far South. As soon as the news reached Harriet, she held a hurried consultation with her brothers, telling them of the terrible things that would befall them if they did not run away to the North. As they stood for a while, looking about anxiously and ready to move on, they agreed to start for the North that night. Harriet began to scratch her head and wonder how she might tell her friends that she was going away. She thought and finally hit upon the plan of telling them in an old familiar song. As she was passing the next cabin door she sang out, "When that old chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. I'm bound for the promised land. Friends, I'm going to leave you. I'm sorry, friends, to leave you. Farewell, oh farewell. But I'll meet you in the morning. Farewell, oh farewell." She looked forward and backward and all around several times. No overseer was in sight. She continued to sing, casting a meaning glance at first one and then another as she passed along. "I'll meet you in the morning when you reach the promised land on the other side of Jordan, for I'm bound for the promised land." That night Harriet and her brothers spoke for a while in a whisper to their father and kissed him good-bye. Without disturbing their dear old mother, each started out quietly in slightly different directions, but all towards the same place. Soon the three came together. The brothers began to say to Harriet in very low tones that they were afraid that old master would send men out for them and capture them. They stood trembling with excitement. All at once one of them, and then the other, broke away and ran towards home as fast as they could, falling now and then over a log or a stump. Harriet stood watching them as long as she could see their shadows in the starlight. Fixing her eye on the North Star, she turned her face in that direction and went forward. All night long she walked until the peep of day. Then she lay down in the tall grass in a swamp. She lay there all day. The next night she started out again. Night after night she traveled, occasionally stopping to beg bread. She crouched behind trees or lay concealed in a swamp during the day until she reached Philadelphia. On her arrival in Philadelphia, she stared at the people as they passed. She stood gazing at the fine houses and the streets. She looked at her hands, believing that they too looked new. After finding a place to stay, she walked out among the better-looking houses and began to ask from door to door if anyone was needed for work. Finally a woman came to the door, opened it just a little way, and peeped out as though she were afraid. As Harriet was asking for work, the lady told her to wait a moment while she ran back and pushed her frying pan further back on the stove. She appeared again at the door, questioned Harriet, and then told her to come in. Harriet walked in and stood listening to the lady's instructions about cleaning. Then she raised the windows and began to sweep. She swept and dusted and cleaned all day. She worked hard the next day and every day until payday, when she received her first money. She hid it away with great care and continued her work. The following paydays she went to the same spot and hid away every penny of her money until she felt that she had enough to go back south. She gave up her work and traveled night after night until she was again back on the plantation. She hid around among the slaves in their cabins. She whispered to them thrilling stories of the free country until even women with babies were getting ready to follow her back to the North. After drugging their babies with paregoric and placing them in baskets which they carried on their arms, they set out with Moses, as they called her, for the free country. They forded rivers, climbed mountains, went through the swamps, threaded the forests with their feet sore and often bleeding. They traveled during the night and kept in hiding during the day. One of the men fell by the wayside. Harriet took out her pistol and, pointing it at his head, said, "Dead men tell no tales. You go on or die." He arose, trembling, and dragged along with the party until they reached the North. As soon as Harriet had landed this party, she began working again and making preparations to go back on her next trip. One night she went back to the plantation, secured a horse and a two-wheeled cart, and drove away with her aged mother and father. After placing them on the train, she traveled in the cart night after night until she made her way through Maryland to Wilmington, Delaware, where she had sent her parents. As soon as the three of them met in Wilmington, Harriet took her parents to a well-known Underground Railroad station. This was simply the home of a Quaker friend. He gave them food and shelter and each a new pair of shoes. He furnished Harriet with money to take her parents on to Canada, and kept the horse and cart for sale. Harriet and her parents went on, making their way with difficulty until they reached Canada. Harriet remained in Canada for a short time only, then slipped back among the plantation cabins in Maryland. Again and again she went back, 19 times, leading away in the darkness in all over 300 slaves. The slave masters of that region in Maryland, whence so many were being stolen away, after trying hard to catch Harriet, offered a reward of $40,000 for her, dead or alive. They posted such a notice in all public places. After 15 years of such adventure, Harriet bought a little home place near Auburn, New York, and settled on it with her dear old parents. Frequently responding to a knock at the door, She arose and found that someone had brought to her a poor, old, homeless person. Without hesitating to ask many questions, she took in every one of them, until she had 20 old people for whom she worked and sought support. William H. Seward, Governor of New York, once said to her when she went to him for aid, "Harriet, you have worked for others long enough. If you would ever ask anything for yourself, I would gladly give it to you, but I will not help you to rob yourself for others any longer." Many years after that, Governor Seward died, and a large number of persons gathered at his funeral. Many very beautiful flowers were received by his family on that sad occasion. On the day of the funeral, just before the coffin was closed, a woman as black as night stole quietly in and laid a wreath of field flowers at his feet, and as quietly glided out again. Friends of the family whispered, "It's the Governor's friend, Harriet." Harriet continued to work and take in homeless old people until the outbreak of the Civil War. At that time, Governor Andrew of Massachusetts sent for her. He asked if she would go south as a spy and a scout, and if need be, a hospital nurse for the Union soldiers. She stood thinking for a moment, then said that she would go. He bade her return home and be ready at a moment's notice. Harriet left his office and returned to Auburn. She went about asking friends to look out for the old people in her home while she was away. Soon after she reached home, a messenger arrived with orders for her to report immediately. She hastily grabbed a few necessary things, kissed her parents, saying good-bye to them and to the inmates of the home, and hurried away to join the company of soldiers on its way south. They traveled several days. As soon as they arrived, Harriet was ordered to act as a scout and a spy for the soldiers. She took charge and led them through the jungle and the swamp. She approached the frightened slaves, often gaining valuable information from them. She stood in the battle line when the shots were falling like hail and the bodies of dead and wounded men were dropping like leaves in autumn. Being called upon to nurse the soldiers in the hospitals, she extracted from roots and herbs what she called a healing substance. As she went to a sick soldier and felt his burning forehead, she often poured out a spoonful of her medicine and placed it in his mouth. After a few days of such treatment, frequently a soldier smiled at her and thanked her. She often bathed the wounds of soldiers from early morning until late at night. She nursed many with smallpox. Occasionally, after a long day's toil, she went to her little cabin and made 50 pies, several pans of gingerbread, and 2 casks of root beer. One of the men went through the camp selling these things for her. Almost as soon as she obtained the money from the sale of them, she mailed it on to her old parents for the support of their home. Once, while Harriet was on this trip, she went with some gunboats up the Combahee River. The frightened slaves along the way left their work and took to the woods. Some of those who fled peeped out from behind trees at the gunboats and ran away like deer when they heard the sound of the steam whistle. One old man said, "Well, Master said the Yankees had horns and tails, but I never believed it till now." 800 of these people were taken on board the gunboats to be carried to Beaufort, South Carolina. Some of them, before going aboard, grabbed from the fire and placed on their heads pails of smoking rice. Others had on their backs a bag with a pig in it, and some carried 2 pigs in their bags. Soon after this trip, Harriet returned to her little home place, which was about to be sold to pay off a mortgage. A friend, the daughter of a professor of Auburn Theological Seminary, hearing of Harriet's trouble, came to see her. Harriet greeted her friend as usual and invited her to sit down. She too sat down and began to tell about the war. Her friend listened for a long, long time, but finally interrupted her to ask about the home and the mortgage. Harriet, concealing nothing from her, told her the exact conditions of the mortgage. The friend suggested the idea of having her life story written as a means of getting money to pay off the mortgage. Harriet nodded her head in full agreement with what her friend was proposing, and asked if she would write the story. The friend counted aloud the days before the mortgage had to be paid off, and, realizing that they were not many, set herself at once to the task of writing the story of Harriet's life. Harriet sat with her friend day after day, each time telling of some incident in her life which she had not told before. The story was finally finished and published, and from the proceeds of it the mortgage was paid off. Harriet worked hard, saying all the time that she wished to free the home of debt so that she might give it to her race to be used as an old folks' home. When the property was almost free of debt and there were 20 aged women in the home, she went among them with a smile, dividing the little she had, until she was stricken with pneumonia and died. Following her death, the Harriet Tubman Club of New York City, together with the whole Empire State Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, erected to her memory a handsome monument. This monument is in the form of a shaft. One of the principal designs on this shaft is in the form of 3 oak logs, out of which flowers are growing. The citizens of Auburn held a memorial meeting for her at the Auditorium Theater. Booker T. Washington, the mayor, and the ex-mayor of Auburn were the speakers on that occasion. The lower floor of the theater was filled, and every box was occupied. In one box sat a group of Civil War veterans, and in another sat the leading society women of Auburn. On the stage sat the Auburn Festival Chorus and Orchestra and the guests. In the presence of this audience, Harriet Tubman's grand niece unveiled a large bronze tablet, the gift of the citizens of Auburn to the memory of Harriet Tubman. In accepting this tablet, the mayor of the city said, "In recognition of Harriet Tubman's unselfish devotion to the cause of humanity, the city of Auburn accepts this tablet dedicated to her memory." The tablet was placed in the county courthouse with the following inscription: "In memory of Harriet Tubman, born a slave in Maryland about 1821, died in Auburn, New York, March 10th, 1913. Called the Moses of her people during the Civil War. With rare courage, she led over 300 negroes up from slavery to freedom, and rendered invaluable service as nurse and spy. With implicit trust in God, she braved every danger and overcame every obstacle. Withal, she possessed extraordinary foresight and judgment, so that she truthfully said, 'On my Underground Railroad I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger.'" End of Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, 1820-1913, from Unsung Heroes by Elizabeth Ross Haynes, published in 1921. Read by Sue Anderson.